I'm Laura Wagner. I'm the Director of Refugee Student Initiatives at the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration. The President's Alliance is a consortium of over 550 college and university presidents, and we work at the intersection of higher education and immigration. We are dedicated to expanding access to higher education for immigrant students, and so we are very excited about this discussion today around in-state tuition access for forcibly displaced students. We want to give a special thank you to our co-sponsors, NASH, Refugee Resettlement Initiative, the President's Alliance, the Refugee Advocacy Lab, and WES, World Education Services. Today's session will provide background and key takeaways on the in-state tuition research that was conducted by IRAP and the Refugee Advocacy Lab. We're going to highlight some inclusive examples and discuss the legislative landscape on in-state tuition. We're also going to provide some case studies of legislative efforts to improve access to in-state tuition for forcibly displaced students. We have an incredible group of speakers here for you today. We're going to kick it off with Senator Michael Dembrow, who represents District 23 in the Oregon State Legislature and was instrumental in Oregon's legislation expanding in-state tuition for refugees, SIVs, humanitarian parolees, and TPS holders. We are then going to turn into Belkis Marig, policy advisor at the Refugee Advocacy Lab and senior policy counsel at IRAP, and Genevieve Kessler, state strategy lead for the Refugee Advocacy Lab, and the director of state advocacy at the International Rescue Committee. And they're both going to tell us a little bit more about the research, resources, and legislative efforts to expand tuition equity for forcibly displaced students. So first, it's my privilege to turn to Senator Michael Dembrow to share a bit about the experience in Oregon. Oregon Senate Bill 553 is one of the most inclusive state policies for granting in-state tuition to forcibly displaced students. So Senator Dembrow, can you tell us a little bit about the work you did to make this legislation possible?
Sure. So our work with refugees and displaced students is relatively recent, but we have been working on the struggle for to extend tuition equity to immigrant students for quite a long time. Really starting back in 2002, where we started the effort to gain in-state tuition for immigrant youth who lacked legal status. It was extremely controversial, as I'm sure you know. It has been for quite a while, and has been plagued by all the controversy that plagues everything related to our broken immigration system here in the United States. That was certainly true before DACA came around, but it has persisted. We worked on it, as I say, starting in 2002. We came very and were unsuccessful. We came very close in 2011. We're finally able to pass it in 2013. And then, fortunately, we're able to build on that, where we followed it 2 years later, granting students, DACA students, financial aid that gave them access to in-state state financial aid, and then extended it further to graduate students. Starting in 2019, 2020, we started working on extending in-state tuition to a particular population of students, those who were from the COFA region. If you're familiar with the COFA, that's the Compact of Free Association. It's students from Micronesia who, for historic reasons, can come to this country legally and work here legally. And we in Oregon have had a long-standing relationship with many Micronesians, and many have come to our state universities as well as to our state. And interestingly, ironically, the greatest number of Micronesian students have been in Eastern Oregon University, which is as far from the coast as you can get for Oregon. It's hundreds of miles from the coast, but for whatever reasons, personal contact, that's where many of the COFA students have come. And there have been advocates pushing to allow them in-state tuition, and they already had access to our state Medicaid program, and they had the ability to work in law enforcement. And so this was kind of a natural process for us. And when we did generate the bill, we actually had a fair amount of bipartisan support, including from my co-chief sponsor was a Republican who represents Eastern Oregon. And I was the committee chair. I chair the education committee. And so it really helped in moving that forward. Having that vehicle of that bill, though, our friends who work in refugee resettlement and ecumenical ministries, which is one of the entities that is very active legislatively in advocating for refugees, asked that could we add to that bill refugees and special immigrant visa holders, which I was very happy to do, and both for undergraduate and graduate students. And so we added that to the bill, which came to be Senate Bill 553, which was introduced in the 2021 session. And the timing was good because there was a lot of talk about Iraqi and Afghan immigrants, especially those who were had worked for the U.S. government as translators, and others who were who needed to leave and to resettle. And for many of my my colleagues who were not really open to extending tuition equity for students who are here, without legal status, for this population, they were very supportive of, and we were able to, to get their support both as sponsors and also as voters. They voted for it. This bill was, in the end, unanimous in our House, and all but one senator voted in support of it. So it was really, it was very successful as far as that went. But, as often happens, we realized immediately after passing it that we had left out some important populations. And we, some of it was my own ignorance. The focus was on refugees, and they had also pointed out the need for special immigrant visa holders. But we were missing those who were here on humanitarian parole, asylum, conditional permanent residency, or especially we heard a lot about temporary protected status people, especially with the Afghan and then Ukrainian refugees coming to us. So we, in 2022, just earlier this year, we had our short legislative session. The way that Oregon works is during the odd-numbered years, we have a long session of 6 months, and then in the even-numbered years, a short session of just 6 weeks. And so we, during that time, we're limited in the number of bills we could do, and we couldn't have a bill just devoted to make that change. But, again, fortunately, I chaired the committee, and so I was able to have an omnibus kind of fix-it bill as it were, just to fix problems that had arisen in the legislation that we passed in 2021. And I was able to stick this in to make those changes to expand the population. And I will say that when we did that, and that was Senate Bill 1522, it coincided with the beginning of the Ukraine war. And so people, at that time were also feeling, very concerned about helping any Ukrainians that were coming to make the transition. So it was successful, and that's where we are today. Yeah.
It's really exciting and really great. And I know you had bipartisan support, but could you share any challenges or opposition you faced or advocates faced in getting this passed?
No, I would say that, we really didn't have a lot of opposition. Again, as I mentioned before, once we were separating the two populations, those who are here with legal status and those who are not. And this is a little difficult for me because I'm a strong advocate for both groups of students and Oregonians. But for tactical reasons, it really helped, I think, to separate those. I will say we had a number of allies in this effort also, which helped. All of those who had worked in the original tuition equity efforts, in support of those who were here without status, were also very supportive of this change and were helpful. Obviously, those who worked in refugee resettlement, but also those who are from the ethnic communities of the refugees were also very helpful. But I will say also our student associations at the colleges and universities were very supportive and very active, as were the faculty associations. And also we didn't get, we had a lot of support from the universities themselves, which was helpful. I will say one thing that we did, I mentioned with the COFA students that we have a number of them at Eastern Oregon University. So we did have to arrange to make an additional appropriation to that university to help, keep them whole for, the reduced tuition that they'd been getting. What they had been doing, and this is really to their credit, they had been using the differential between in-state and the out-of-state rate in order to fund student support services for those COFA students, which was great. And we wanted to make sure that that continued. So we, we gave them a special extra appropriation for that. And that helped with that. And that's, for the refugees, they're not necessarily going to be affecting one particular university. It's more spread around the state. So there was no concern from the universities about our need to do that. But that's something that, that anyone working in this space might want to consider. I will say finally, another set of advocates that and supporters that people should be thinking about are those who are working in the workforce area, workforce development, our different workforce boards, et cetera, and even the business community, which has an interest in getting refugees, trained, educated, those who were practitioners in their home countries, getting them as quickly, certified, licensed here in the state as quickly as possible, just to meet our dramatic workforce shortages, which I think we're experiencing all over the country right now. So that's also an angle I would really suggest that people take advantage of.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting all the potential allies to this work. Before I turn it over to our next speakers, are there any other last recommendations or pro tips you would recommend to other states looking to pass similar legislation?
No, just, I think that I did take a look at the blog that that you all had, which I found very, very helpful and useful. And I would agree, it's a real patchwork of approaches in the different states. And in some of the states, the only language and statute there is really is focused more on the students who are here without legal status. And again, they're different. And, for those who are here without legal status, it was important for us to make sure that they were young people who had grown up here, who had gone to high school here, and then, would be, continuing on. But, with the refugee population, the displaced population, it's very different. And that language, I think, really doesn't apply. It can't apply. How could it apply?
Yeah, we speak of immigrants sometimes as a monolith, but they're very, very unique individual populations and individuals. So it's important to address all those needs.
Anyway, I'll stay with you. I look forward to hearing what the others have to say. And if there are any questions that any in the audience have, I'd be very happy to address them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Senator Denbrough, for sharing your experience and expertise with us. I'm now going to turn to Belkis, who is policy advisor at the Refugee Advocacy Lab and senior counsel at IRAP. And she is going to tell us a little bit about the overview, the background, and the key takeaways of the in-state tuition resource and research.
Thank you so much, Laura. If we can turn it to the next slide, please. I just thought I'd open up a little bit about the lab and who we are, since some of you might not be familiar. The Refugee Advocacy Lab is an initiative hosted by Refugees International and co-led with IRAP, which is the organization that I'm based out of, the International Rescue Committee, which is where Genevieve, my colleague who'll be presenting after, comes from, and the Refugee Congress. We're grounded in refugee leadership, and we collaborate with a wide range of partners who power our work. Our aim is to grow the movement for U.S. leadership on refugee protection and inclusion. And we do that by developing strategic communication resources, championing inclusive policies, and advancing the field through diverse partnerships, capacity building, and refugee leadership development. So that's a little bit about us. Senator Denbrough, you gave us a really good introduction to some of the issues facing displaced students, and I thought it might be useful for the audience who might not be as familiar with some of the terminology that we're using to kind of go through what each status means, because each status has a different legal definition. So refugees, when we use that term, it's and these are truncated, quick definitions, but it's somebody who is unable or unwilling to return to their country because of a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. They're eligible for permanent residency after 1 year of arriving in the US, but upon arrival, they're basically a permanent status, even though they don't have LPR status. Special immigrant visa holders generally refers to Afghans and Iraqis employed by or on behalf of the US government, including interpreters. They're admitted upon arrival as permanent residents. And so when we did a lot of this research, SIVs, in terms of like qualifying for residency, because they're LPRs upon arrival, they face slightly less barriers when it comes to residency. Of course, when you arrive new to a country, it takes a really long time to actually establish your residency. They don't get driver's licenses right away or leases and things that would normally prove residency. And so even though they're eligible after a year, realistically speaking, it's very difficult for newcomers to actually prove that. The next status is asylees. And they're basically the same as refugees, but it refers to people who are either in the United States or make a claim at a port of entry. And it also generally refers to those whose asylum applications are granted, which is different than asylum seekers, who on the next slide are those with pending applications for asylum. And, you know, there are huge asylum backlogs in this country. It can take years for someone's asylum application to get adjudicated. I think the average right now for a first interview is 4 years. So this is a population that can be in this country for an extremely long amount of time, and they're eligible to work after a certain period of time of being here. They can apply for an EAD after 150 days, subject to a few rules. And so for all intents and purposes, they're here lawfully, they're working, they're contributing to our communities, but oftentimes, you know, at least in the in-state or in a lot of public benefits, they're left out. And then humanitarian parolees, which is, you know, what a lot of Afghan and Ukrainian and most recently Venezuelans, you know, that's the status that they have. And it's, you know, it's a temporary status for an urgent humanitarian reason or public benefit. And usually they're paroled into the US for 1 to 2 years, and they can apply for reparole. They're also eligible to work, and, you know, they can also make asylum claims once they're here, if applicable. And then temporary protected status, or TPS. That's for people who are already here, and, you know, a lot of Afghans who are already here on student visas, or Ukrainians that were here. And, you know, there's a list of about 15 countries of, you know, nationalities who have TPS status, who can't return to their countries because of, you know, the situation in that country is unsafe for them to return. And they're also eligible to work and can be here for many years. There's countries on that list that have, you know, been on there for a really long time due to protracted conflict. So that's like a quick overview of the different legal statuses. So most recently, the Biden administration has been using humanitarian parole as an expedient pathway to allow Afghans to evacuate during the withdrawal, to arrive here quickly, and most recently for Ukrainians, and now for Venezuelans. Prior to that, humanitarian parole was relatively obscure. It wasn't that commonly known. Even for those of us that work in the displacement field, we had to quickly become familiar with it. But it's a temporary status, and, you know, starting, you know, since the U4U program was announced, as well as the Afghan evacuation, we're going to start seeing numbers approaching 200,000 parolees in the country, and, you know, starting next year, it might even surpass that. And likewise, you know, as I mentioned, TPS and asylum seekers are also increasing because of these emergencies. So because these are temporary statuses, it means that they may not be eligible for certain public benefits. And that's especially true for asylum seekers and TPS holders, and especially true in the context of in-state tuition. And, you know, as the Senator alluded to, it really is a total patchwork from each public benefit to each status. It's been completely different. And we didn't come across this issue. As I mentioned, we weren't as familiar with parolees, and we kind of stumbled across this with our experience in Virginia, where a large number of Afghan parolees were settled there. And as we were doing advocacy, we were hoping that they would qualify for, Virginia has a law where refugees and SIVs upon arrival can qualify for in-state tuition. And we were hoping that that would be extended to parolees. But unfortunately, it was, the definition was strictly tied to the legal definition of refugees. And so that wasn't an option, but we had wrongfully assumed that they would, you know, after a year, they could become residents and they could qualify through the residency path. And we quickly discovered that was actually not true, because Virginia actually does not permit parolees to establish residency for tuition purposes, which came as a real surprise to us, because parolees are eligible for FAFSA, for federal financial aid. And so we didn't expect that they wouldn't be eligible to establish residency. And this is regardless of how long they live in the state. If they're parolees for 4 or 5 years, it didn't matter. If they're asylum seekers, it also didn't matter. They still weren't eligible for in-state tuition in Virginia. And so we had the situation, which, you know, is particularly heartbreaking for the Afghan community who's escaping the Taliban, who risked their lives, you know, to support the US's mission. And, you know, the Taliban are known for restricting access to Afghan women, and they come here, and unfortunately, they're facing the obstacle of non-resident tuition fees, which, you know, are 3 times the cost, and they, you know, they can barely afford in-state tuition fees. And so, you know, non-resident fees are just a completely insurmountable barrier for them. And this kind of triggered us to say, to look and be like, you know, where else in the United States is this a problem? We were surprised that Virginia, with all of its rather generous in-state tuition policies, was a state that didn't grant in-state tuition for humanitarian parolees and asylum seekers. Where else was this a problem? And we started this project to canvass the entire country and look at what those policies were. And to our surprise, this was a problem, you know, almost everywhere. And for in most situations, you know, we found states that, you know, specifically excluded parolees and asylum seekers and TPS holders, but then there was several states that simply just did not mention whether they were included. So you can imagine if you're, you know, an employee of an institution trying to figure out what a student's eligible for, or, you know, an Afghan or Ukrainian or another, you know, someone from another population who's within these statuses trying to figure out if you're eligible. Those policies were very difficult to figure out. And we were attorneys and law students trying to figure this out. And so, you know, not the typical, you know, like, this is what we work in. And the way the policies were worded, we just couldn't figure it out in a lot of situations. Next slide, please. So just in terms of framing, you know, and I'll be focusing most of my presentation on residence, like access to residency. But there are other pathways, and we alluded to the refugee and SIV pathways, but just to kind of put this in front of you all in terms of, you know, what are the pathways to in-state tuition? There's residency, which is the most common, and what I'll be focusing on, but there are also other pathways. And so, you know, it's not exclusively just residency, and I don't want folks to kind of lose sight of those other pathways that exist. And I especially want to point out tuition waivers as an option that I'll get into later, but that for folks to be aware of. So next slide. In terms of numbers, I thought it would be helpful to kind of demonstrate, you know, what the numbers are. So we found that at least in 17 states, humanitarian parolees were explicitly not eligible for in-state tuition, regardless of how long they've lived in the state. And in a further 21, the policies did not specify whether parolees would qualify, making it difficult for us to actually determine conclusively if they qualify or not. For asylum seekers, they were probably the worst off, and you see that percentage on the screen there, but 19 states, they weren't eligible in 19 states, and 16 states did not mention them in their policies at all. And when I say states, I mean that loosely. You know, some states have their residency policies in legislation or in, you know, the states set that, but for most states, it's their higher education office or council of education, or it's a university system. And in some states, the institutions themselves set their own policies because they have authority to do that. So I use that term loosely. We even discovered a few surprising examples. Oh, sorry, can we go back to the other slide? We even discovered a few surprising examples of states prohibiting all non-citizens from qualifying for in-state tuition unless they were legal permanent residents. And frankly, that's just illegal. And so that was also surprising to see. Institutions can't discriminate on the basis of they can't discriminate between lawful statuses where someone could be here permanently. And so LPRs aren't the only ones that could be here for an extended permanent period of time. Refugees could be, asylees, and there's also certain categories of visas that are also not precluded from establishing a domicile in the United States. so that's kind of a quick summary of what we found in our research. Next slide, please. So why do some states have these restrictive residency policies, and can non-citizens qualify to be residents? And the general answer is states can be as inclusive as they want. And as the senator alluded to earlier, the only restriction relates to undocumented immigrants. And that's where we see a lot of the tuition equity bills that refer to high school attendance for a certain number of years. There is a set of federal laws that were passed in 1996, which said that if you're going to offer undocumented students in-state tuition benefits, you have to offer those to U.S. students regardless of their residence. It doesn't say you can't give them in-state tuition, you just have to offer it to U.S. students. And those laws also distinguish between different categories of immigrants, and that's where the term qualified immigrant comes from. And if you look at our tracker or review your state policy, you'll see a lot of states refer to qualified immigrants. And some states, in their zealousness to exclude undocumented students, they adopted that language of qualified immigrant. So for example, Tennessee and Georgia, refer to qualified immigrants, but they, I guess, inadvertently included parolees, and because parolees are actually considered qualified immigrants pursuant to that federal legislation. And so there is like a bit of, it really is a patchwork, is what we found. The other restriction that states face is that they can't arbitrarily discriminate between classes of non-citizens. And I mentioned this earlier, and this has led to a lot of institutions who tried to track the language in a Supreme Court decision of Toll versus Marino to kind of list an alphabet soup of visas that qualify or don't qualify. And, unfortunately, that was the outtake from Toll versus Marino, but it really wasn't what the decision said. And unfortunately, in their effort to kind of track that language, they ended up, including or excluding visa categories in an incorrect manner, and also leaving out asylees or asylum seekers and TPS holders and humanitarian parolees who are not categories of visas. Next slide, please. And so we did come across a few good examples of policies. In New York, SUNY really stood out for being very clear and classifying, having a, none of the categories we surveyed were excluded. It was easy to read. It was very, each status was set out and whether they qualified or not. And that was very helpful. And it removed any guesswork on our part. Florida also had relatively clear and inclusive policy, which, was also a bit surprising. But, it wasn't as thorough as New York's, but it was also very good. It was short, it was clear. You knew what statuses were included and what weren't. Several states use valid EADs as a way to determine whether a non-citizen was eligible. And even though EADs can be difficult for certain categories to obtain due to backlogs, but generally speaking, it does open up a larger or a wider category of non-citizens that could be eligible, because there's a lot of, lawful statuses that are EAD eligible. And then there's states like Colorado, which, simply said, non-immigrant categories like international student visas were not eligible, but everyone else was eligible. And that kind of also removed some guesswork. And so that was an example of a good policy. So I know we're kind of running on time, so I'm going to try to be quick here, but, for those in the audience who either work at an institution or are advocates, we invite you to take a look at our in-state tuition tracker, which Laura will send out after this webinar, and also like the key takeaways in our blog, and for you to look up, what the policies are in your state. And if they're not, clear or accessible, or they're arbitrary and make distinctions that don't make sense, or illegal, hopefully not, we urge you to, approach the responsible authority, be it the higher education office or your state, or, you know, the institution that's responsible for the policy, and it varies by each state. It's also really important to, you know, train staff and decision makers who make these decisions on these policies. I think, you know, it can be confusing, even for attorneys who practice in this area, to figure out, you know, who's eligible, what does the terminology mean? So it's really important to have trained staff to make those decisions. And there are also, you know, for schools that have the discretion to grant tuition waivers, that's a really effective way to allow parolees and TPS holders to access in-state tuition. And we know of examples of schools that have done that. And the one thing that I would say is to kind of publicize and make that, you know, available to students who are just checking your websites and trying to figure out if they qualify or not. And we know from the clients that we serve that a lot of them think that they're not eligible simply because they go on a school's website and don't see, you know, their status mentioned. And so it's really important to kind of have, you know, a catch-all and say, these tuition waivers available, please apply, and we will, you know, look at your application. And of course, you know, my colleague Genevieve will go into this in more detail, but, you know, support tuition equity bills in your state, and feel free to take advantage of the resources and the networks that are available to you. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague Genevieve.
Thanks so much, Balkis. Thanks also to Senator Demrow for joining today, and for those of you who are on the line participating. Glad to see so many folks interested in this issue area. For this portion of the agenda, we're going to balance out the policy context with the advocacy efforts to advance legislation regarding this policy at the state level specifically. So who is affected? What does the legislation do, and how this can impact colleges and universities, as well as communities at large, and what are some effective strategies. Let's also take some time to reflect on the immigration statuses that Balkis just walked us through as we move along, as well as some of the limitations surrounding that. Then we're going to dig in on, as I mentioned, the winning strategies. This issue is a focus in states across the country. So how do we make sure that it continues to have bipartisan support? How can we be thinking about broadening the impacted populations, and where has that hit a wall? Next, we're going to dig in on a case study of an effort that did not succeed. So what did the language say in that situation for that state? How was the narrative shifted against us? And I look forward to discussing this further in the Q&A or the discussion session at the end of our time together. And finally, I'll end my portion of the presentation with you running through some of the best ways that we have seen to engage on these measures. And again, I'll welcome your discussions and feedback at that time. If we could go to the next slide, please. So what does access to higher education mean? This comes down to dollars, specifically access to the in-state tuition rates that you've been hearing over and over about today, which are offered by state colleges and universities, but with access regulated by the state in many cases. For those who might not be familiar, state college or university systems generally have those two rates in place for tuition. One is for the in-state residents, and the other is for out-of-state residents. For those who are seeking to qualify for in-state residence, you generally need to provide that proof of physical residence within the state for at least 1 year, and in some cases 2 years. I did a quick search of comparative rates in a few states and dug up some examples for you. So we talked a little bit about New York already. If you were registering as a student with the state university system in New York, an in-state resident would be paying $7,000 for tuition annually. An out-of-state resident is being charged almost $17,000. In a state like Oklahoma, that rate is $4,700 for in-state versus over $12,000 for out-of-state. And in California, the cost per credit hour is $47 for an in-state resident and $680 for an out-of-state resident. So you can see the pattern here. Mind you, this is just the tuition. This is not any of the other fees that are associated with attending college. Many immigrants who arrive in the US and are new to the country, let alone a state, are unable to provide that proof of in-state residency for a year to 2 years as may be required. This means that for those seeking to attend college or return to college after their attendance abroad was interrupted, they're forced to assess their ability to pay an out-of-state tuition rate, which, as we just discussed, can be double, triple, or even quadruple in some states. Such an increase is untenable for many Americans, and especially those who are facing resettlement to this country and trying to rebuild their lives here. The conversation around access to in-state tuition rates has been controversial for over a decade. And we talked about this with Senator Dembrow and the issue related to DACA recipients and how that has been approached. And that affects even those folks who were educated in a K-12 system and maybe graduated from. Other immigrants, who Balkis highlighted in her slides, are also impacted by these rates, of course. In 2017, the IRC and IRAP worked with legislators in California to advance a measure that would allow refugees and special immigrant visa recipients specifically, which is those translators and staff who worked with the US in Afghanistan and Iraq, access to in-state tuition rates, but in that situation, only at 2-year institutions. The focus on the impact of this legislation has extended to other states who have an appreciation for that. For refugees and other vulnerable populations resettled to the US, for their safety, the ability to return to college upon arrival is critical. Some need to continue their education, picking up from their former lives. Others need to return to school in an effort to recover their careers, as Senator Dembrow highlighted. And some come to the US in the middle of their senior year of high school and are eager to begin their higher education journey. Even if they do not return to school within the first 6 months, the likelihood that these folks will ever return decreases significantly. After that time, many find themselves trapped in survival jobs, working to pay rent, support their families, and just get by as they rebuild their lives here in the US. This is a loss not just for the individual, but for our communities at large, and leads to a growing problem in this country called brain waste. When individuals cannot access the education to reach a higher paying career, then the state and the communities miss out not just on the unachieved talent that might have been, but also on the increased spending power and taxable income. It's a loss for the colleges and universities as well, who may be struggling with admissions rates. Next slide, please. So what we found that works well are a few things related to advancing these policies. First, we always encourage pursuit of bipartisan support in the introduction of the work. There are compelling messages and talking points that can meet a variety of political interests when discussing access to higher education. This is an investment in people, it's an investment in the economic outcomes for the state, and it's a welcoming policy that has tangible results. Generally, policies like this draw the support not just of the education community, but even the broader business community. A high-skilled population means that critical jobs are being filled, businesses are grown, and a workforce is readily available. The policy also resonates for those who want to support the idea of the American dream, give people bootstraps to access in-state tuition so that they can then go on to achieve their goals. Secondly, engage impacted communities, refugees, DACA recipients, and others who are impacted by these restrictive policies should be empowered to represent themselves before elected partners. Those compelling first-person stories make all the difference, particularly for those legislators that want to hear the first-hand accounts of the challenges and difficulties that these individuals are facing as a result of existing policy. Next, we want to make sure that we can engage the education community itself. State leaders also want to know what university leaders think of expanding policies like this. What will the impact be? Questions that are typical for these partners from legislators are, do you have enough seats to meet potential demand in your classrooms? How will you manage the influx of applications? Is there a broader impact? And these questions, of course, take us to the last point, the fiscal impact. Conversations with the ed community in particular should address any financial implications. Often legislators will want to know if opening up in-state tuition rates means that colleges and universities will take a financial hit. They don't understand that if folks can't access in-state tuition rates, they simply are not applying or enrolling. Next slide, please. One state where we attempted to introduce this policy, but unfortunately were not successful, was in Georgia this year. So going back to 2021, the state had passed HR 11, which established a committee to assess barriers to professional entry for global talent that exists within the state. One challenge that was consistently elevated throughout that process was the difficulties accessing in-state tuition rates at colleges and universities. So in 2022, we and our partners based in Georgia worked to introduce legislation that would specifically address that challenge. And the legislation was ambitious. HB 932 provided that non-citizen students with certain refugee, special immigrant, or humanitarian parole status would be classified as in-state for tuition purposes. The legislation was unique in the expanded population that it included. Historically, in-state tuition legislation, as we've noted already, has focused on just DACA or just refugees. With the evacuations from Afghanistan and the arrival of parolees in 2021, though, the sponsoring Republicans sought to ensure that they too could benefit from this change. Unfortunately, though, he was unable to rally his own caucus in support, and they fractured over the policy in committee. There were a few points where we took political hits. The first was a lack of understanding of the immigration status and what differing statuses meant insofar as arrivals, access to work authorization, and contribution to broader communities. This is a common challenge that we face and generally try to address it and resolve it through direct one-on-one meetings. The second challenge was, of course, the politicization of the issue because of strong sentiments related to arrival of immigrants, different immigration categories, and talking points all associated with that. And finally, the most damaging challenge that we faced was a lack of understanding of the college admissions process. What evolved from this challenge was a talking point that by facilitating access to in-state tuition, these individuals would be jumping the line ahead of Georgians rather than all collectively applying in the same way. We were unable to overcome this false talking point, and ultimately that killed the bill. So hope during our discussion segment today that we can address how advocates and education leaders can be more involved in helping to address these challenges and overcome these talking points and doubts about the legislation. Next slide, please. Within the lab network of states, in the coming year, we have a few locations where we are engaging with legislators and hoping to introduce this policy for 2023 state session. First, we are undeterred in Georgia, and though our previous sponsor has retired, we're engaging with a new group of legislators to assess the possibility of introducing this measure once again. In Kansas, we also plan to address this measure and see introduction in the new year. Earlier this year, we had hosted legislators at a local resettlement office in Wichita, and refugees who spoke with them elevated this as a challenge in their post-arrival. And finally, in Utah, we are also working with legislators and crafting language for this legislation, again, for 2023 state session. Next slide, please. So how can you be engaged? The first is to find your network. If you're in one of the 3 states I just mentioned, message me, let's talk. A broad coalition of support for policy and advocacy work is important to meet the interests and priorities of legislators voting on this issue. The next is to be engaged. Think about the legislation as it advances and provide hearing testimony, which can often be issued in person or even online. Your voice matters, and if you're representing a higher ed institution, this cannot be overstated. Next is to participate in other aspects of the legislative process. Attend legislative meetings, participate in strategic planning, build support within your communities and networks. Other elements of this is through documentation. Contribute to those sign-on letters so legislators can see the breadth of support within their states and communities. And of critical importance, of course, is the voices of those impacted by these policies, especially those who could benefit from the policy change. Uplift their stories on your social media outlets. Ensure that these individuals are included in the advocacy efforts along the way. And finally, make sure that your message is clear. Talk about impact for individuals and communities. And of both action and inaction, what will states continue to miss out on by not changing this policy? Next slide, please. And with that, I will turn it back over to Laura.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Genevieve and Belkis, for sharing. And I just want to flag for everyone that we did put the link to the tracker as well as the key takeaways in the chat. So feel free, if you want to deep dive geek out on in-state tuition policy, it's a really amazing resource for that. I'm going to open it up to questions. We're going to start with some questions in the chat. So feel free to continue to add questions to the chat, or if you prefer to raise your hand and you can ask your question live. But I want to circle, there's a wonderful conversation between Carly and Darlene and Lindsay around parolee. And Belkis, I just didn't know if you had anything to add about access for parolees.
There are a ton of questions in the chat, so I'm trying to read them all. So I don't want to accidentally miss any.
Yeah, so this one's specifically around having to, as a qualified immigrant, having to produce USCIS documentation that has intent to become a US citizen or permanent resident. And there is a DOE exemption for Afghans, but wanted to clarify if there was anything for Ukrainians or other humanitarian parolees.
Yeah, so for Georgia, and I'm recalling this off the top of my head from the tracker, so pardon me, but we can say something, but on the ground reality could be something else, and every institution or school might disagree with our interpretation. But in my mind, parolees in Georgia should be blanket eligible because they are a qualified immigrant, and to show that intent for being here permanently, if they submit an asylum application, the receipt for that should be sufficient to prove that, and they shouldn't be asking for more. And so that would be my response, but I'd love to hear back from Darlene and those on the ground, and feel free to reach out, on what actually happens when this occurs. I know, I don't know if Tanya Broder's on the call from NILC, but sometimes they would send letters. NILC would send letters saying, we disagree with your interpretation. Here's, what the law is and what our interpretation is. And sometimes institutions take that into consideration. And so there's ways to kind of have a dialogue in those kinds of scenarios.
Awesome. Thanks so much. What recommendations do you all have for states where if when you go into the tracker, you'll see that some states the tuition varies by institution. And so if you're an individual institution and you're looking to create, you're in an institution and the policy is not inclusive. Any recommendations for individual institutions to really build an inclusive policy?
Did I take that question?
Sure.
So it really, each institution should check what their authority is and how much flexibility they have so that they don't run afoul of, their state laws. But if they do have the authority and they do have that flexibility, they can do tuition waivers. They can implement, a lot of university systems or schools can implement new policies, and they have that flexibility to do that. And so, for all intents and purposes, the populations that we're talking today that Senator Dembrow alluded to, these are lawful statuses. They are people that are in our communities who are living, working, for all intents and purposes, just like everybody else in these communities. And there really is no reason to deny them access to education. We know from states that have inclusive policies that it hasn't resulted, in a financial impact because, in-state tuition is not free tuition. It still increases the revenues that these schools receive. And so, if there are ways, then, we highly would urge institutions to use the discretionary policies and to like make those available to students so that they're aware of them.
Awesome. Also just want to flag a question around residency requirements. If someone's looking to understand more about what the residency requirement is for their state, where could they find that information, or how would they access that?
So in our tracker, if you look at the policies that we have on the left-hand side, usually you can click to the policy and it'll usually list out in detail what would qualify for residency. But it's usually either, in state law or in, if it's a higher education board, it's usually in their policy, but it's all in our tracker. And if you have a hard time finding it, feel free to reach out to us. We can help you find it as well.
We are almost out of time, but I just want to encourage everyone. Senator Dembrow put his email and contact information in the chat. Thank you so much. And Belkis and Genevieve also both offered up their contact information if you're interested in reaching out to them. So a huge thank you to all of you for participating in this conversation and really diving deeper on in-state tuition access. I also just want to give another thank you to our co-sponsors, NASH Refugee Resettlement Initiative, the President's Alliance, Refugee Advocacy Lab, and World Education Services. I also want to flag a couple of resources from our co-sponsors that also help to expand access to forcibly displaced students. So the first is the West Gateway Program, which is provides credential evaluation for forcibly displaced students from specifically hard to access credential countries, Afghanistan, Eritrea, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Ukraine, and Venezuela. I also want to flag that NASH Refugee Resettlement Initiative recently released a Catalyst Fund in partnership with WES that provides funding for NASH institutions, so higher ed institutions that are members of NASH, to engage in refugee work and engage in enrolling refugee students. So I'll put that information in the chat as well. Thank you, Jane, you're one step ahead. And then last but not least, the President's Alliance maintains a higher education immigration portal that provides regular updates on resources and state policy information, so you can keep up to date with that. We will be sending an email to all of you with both the recording as well as the links to the research and tracker and any links were shared here today. Again, thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful day.